So, what do you think of when you hear globalization? I'm going to turn on my pointer here. I miss doing PowerPoint. I like PowerPoint. Google Slides just doesn't have that pen feature or the zoom in like you like it. So, what do you think of when you hear globalization? Some of the themes and topics that were covered last week, words that came up were, whoa, wrong way. Interconnectedness. The world is more interconnected due to globalization. Transnational corporations now today on a large scale operate across international borders. Corporations like Apple, while they have their headquarters in the United States in California, only have one or two factories in the United States itself, but have a majority of their operations in East Asia and places like China or Vietnam, and increasingly more India. McDonald's, another multinational corporation, not Apple. McDonald's actually has, I think it's 36,000 restaurants in over 100 countries. McDonald's, another great representation of globalization. We should think of McDonald's when we hear globalization. Coca-Cola. You had to do some stuff on Coca-Cola last week. Coca-Cola serves out like something crazy like 1.3 billion servings of their products worldwide per day. Over 700,000 employees across the globe as well, and they operate in over 200 countries, and that's almost all of them. There's around 210 countries total in the world today. Sesame Street. Sesame Street is kind of an interesting take on globalization where we take something from one culture, the United States, and then it is transplanted and adopted to fit other cultures and their needs. But at the same time, this spreads American culture. And so this is a representation of cultural globalization. Death. Thank you, Braden Curry, with his talking about death in his words for, yes, death is a result of globalization. So I included it there, but it's not the only thing. War is an increasing topic after globalization comes about, and what we'll introduce today. Coronavirus, pandemics, disease, they have increased because of globalization. They're spread. Um, Smallpox came to the Americas from Europe through the Columbian Exchange, as we talked about earlier in the year in class, and killed almost 90% of the native population in the Americas. So around 30 million people, Native Americans, died in the Americas after 1492 due to disease. And that is another example of the consequences of globalization. I'm going to mess up from time to time in the video, so just ignore my mess ups because I'm not going to go back and fix the videos over and over again. Otherwise, I would never get them done. Rich get richer. And so another theme that was talked about last week was the increase of the wealth gap, where the rich keep getting richer and the poor are getting poorer due to globalization. And then that follows the theme of exploitation, where rich countries take advantage of poor countries and take their stuff. But at the same time, those poor countries do get more money than they normally would have due to globalization. And so those are some good words to think of when we think of globalization going forward. And I'm going to go ahead and move on from the slide. Globalization background and history. And so I'm going to try to do a quick review. You have this on video, so you can go back and listen to me. I bet I talk maybe as fast as John Green at times, but here we go. Definition, the integration and interconnectedness of economic, political, and cultural systems across the globe. And so globalization is really a concept that can be split into three parts. There are three types of globalization. And so those three types are economic globalization, where we have transnational corporations that sell products across international borders and also take resources from multiple places across the globe. Cultural globalization is a result, and so economic globalization tends to be the first form of globalization we see. Cultural globalization then is a result of it, where people are moving to other places and taking their culture with them. And so a consequence of cultural globalization is that Christianity today is the #1 largest religion on earth with 2.1 billion people that practice it. In political globalization, the United Nations, some of you may know what that is, some of you not, but that is our world government. And without globalization, economic globalization, cultural globalization, we wouldn't have a world government that tries to unite the governments of the world into a single body to make decisions. And so that's an example of how power is distributed throughout the globe. Economic globalization, we're going to talk more about it, begins with the age of exploration and colonization started by Europeans in the 1400s. And I apologize if you hear my son behind me or my daughters. It's just the way it goes. And so when the Europeans go out in search of different trade routes, Columbus, Vasco da Gama, so on and so forth, when Europeans go out and look for places to sell their goods and take goods back to sell in Europe, this is where globalization started. Europeans create international trade routes that connected the old world and the new world. And we talked about that. The Columbian Exchange is an example of globalization. And in many ways, it's our earliest form of like across the ocean globalization, because economic globalization really starts with the Silk Road, but I'm kind of skipping and glazing over that for time purposes. Established trade routes from Europe to South and East Asia. As a result, large corporations develop and drive colonization and imperialism. And so European corporations in these countries gain power and help further globalization and it taking hold, and so that the world becomes more and more interconnected. And so the first corporation that we see, or large-scale transnational corporation, is the British East India Company. And so it operates in India and East Asia, trading spices and cotton. And the British East India Company is actually the group that starts the international drug trade, where they have lots of opium in their colonies in India, and they don't want to sell it to Europeans or British people in the home country because it's drugs and bad for society. And so they forced the Chinese to allow them in the 1800s to start selling opium to Chinese markets. And so the international drug trade gets started by the British Empire and a British corporation. Thanks, Great Britain. Going next to cultural globalization. This is the result of trade routes established during age of exploration. Cultural elements like language, religion spread along trade routes. So the examples are, and this was from last week as well, Christianity becomes the world's largest religion, spreads all over the earth. Spanish is the third most common language. It spreads from the Iberian Peninsula in Europe, where a couple million people spoke it, but now it is spoken all over the world with 477 million native speakers. And then English is spoken on every continent today instead of just an island to the north of mainland Europe, with 370 native speakers and 600 million non-native speakers who mostly live in India. Political globalization, result of world conflict. League of Nations is our first attempt at world government or political globalization. This is a result of World War I, our first truly worldwide global conflict intended to promote and enforce world peace. The United Nations is our world government today, and it is founded after World War II. Its mission is to promote world peace, provide welfare in response to disaster, and protect groups against genocide. And so genocide also is something that is a consequence of globalization and world conflict, as we'll get to that topic next week.